talk about, or I'm going to tell my story briefly as part of my presentation. But basically, y'all have me for the course of the next hour. And Ginger, I need you to allow me to screen share, please. And if I get glitchy, please let me know. I may have to stop my video for the PowerPoint. But so far, so good. Are y'all hearing me fine? Great. Thank you. And so we're going to get right into this because, as Ginger knows, I can talk about this stuff all day. Ginger asked me to primarily come and talk to you all about harm reduction as it relates to supporting people through active drug use into stages of recovery. And so I am, I'm alive because of recovery, of course, and because I found a pathway of recovery that made sense for me over 6 years ago. But I also used and sold drugs for over 10 years. And, for the last 5 of that, I was an injection drug user, and I'm alive because of harm reduction. And I come from a social circle of people who are alive because of naloxone and harm reduction. And so really just, it means a lot for me to come and share my experience and the experience of people who oftentimes aren't heard, and so it's really stands out to me that, professional first responders, EMS, and are you all EMS and fire up there? Is it like a dual thing, or is it? I mean, either way, it's just really cool that y'all are coming to learn about this stuff. So we only have an hour together, and I want to throw a lot of information at you, but I also would love some participation throughout. So I'm going to ask a few times for a volunteer to kind of read off the screen. No huge pressure. Definitely stop options for sure. I'm going to have a hard time keeping an eye on the chat as we get into this. So Ginger, definitely let me know if I should stop and field the question. EMS agencies, yeah, they're combined. Yeah, down here varies place to place, but some of the coolest, I'm gonna get into that in a minute. Either way, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Today, we're gonna spend the next hour together, hopefully more conversational than just me talking for an hour, but whatever happens, happens. We're going to talk about myself and my lived experience as a former injection drug user and person in recovery. We're going to talk about harm reduction and maybe, how you define harm reduction, and maybe how you define harm reduction an hour from now. And then we'll see how that relates to recovery-oriented systems. And then we'll get into a little bit about harm reduction programs like syringe services programs, and a little bit on opioid overdose aftercare was something that Ginger thought should kind of be in here as part of the work I've done with the Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire, and now with New Hampshire Providers Association. We're really looking at anoxic brain injury post-overdose and how that's impacting treatment and recovery, and why y'all see the same person 3 times in 24 hours and they don't seem to be learning, and it's cognitive impairment from an anoxic brain injury. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then that'll lead nicely into supporting people who use drugs, because ultimately, y'all are probably the most literal on the front lines. You see it, something's going on before the news knows, so appreciate spending this time with you. So I'd love to hear from y'all as we get into this, for sure. And I for sure wish I could learn more of your life stories. I think I heard 2 people in sustained recovery, which is really cool that you can talk about that and be in your profession. I've done other EMS, fire, law enforcement trainings in New Hampshire, and that's like, I've never seen that. I've never seen somebody who, is first response and says, I'm in recovery. Like, that really made me happy. So I wish I could, spend an hour learning about each and every one of you. But, I'm somebody who is, like I said, alive because of naloxone. So I come from a relatively privileged background. I was on the poorer end of the spectrum, but I grew up in Hampton, New Hampshire, I grew up in a beach town that was just, I had all my needs met, the straight white male from New Hampshire, went to a great school, had great extended family. I had some trauma as a kid from someone outside my family, and that's followed me to today. I had some mental health issues as a kid as a result of, that assault on me as a kid. And I didn't really know how to address that. And so I know now that I was like a kid with PTSD, but I just didn't want to be here. I wanted to be out of myself. And, I was, early to read and did pretty well in school. And, at my first escape was really like books and reading and throwing myself into studies as a form of escapism. I didn't know that. And then it was video games and television, and then it was getting into trouble. And as, alcohol kind of worked as a solvent to tear my family apart, that kind of left me alone a lot while, my father was no longer around. My mom was at the bar. And up until high school, I hated drugs. I didn't really want anything to do with drugs. I just basically learned in middle school that people do drugs because they're losers and they're going to get me with them. Like at some point, they're going to jump out and get me with them. And I enter into high school, I'm suicidal. I'm cutting myself because I have PTSD and don't know how to express how I feel. I don't have the words for mental health or emotions. I'm just basically like this 14-year-old who cuts himself because he doesn't know what to do. And I get to high school and people are drinking alcohol and smoking pot and taking drugs, and the cool kids are, and my social circle now is. And the first drug I took was actually an opiate that was prescribed to me for an injury I got in lacrosse in middle school and didn't take. And then from there, it was alcohol and pill seeking a bit, and then cannabis. And then I basically realized that, well, in hindsight, what was really going on is that these behaviors were serving a purpose. My mom wasn't home very much. And I found things that made me feel okay. I found things that did for me what society was not doing for me. Ginger, were you able to let that person in? I got a alert that somebody was trying to be let in.
They're in. Yes.
All right.
We'll take care of that.
So cool. All right. I just want to make sure that I'm post. Audio good so far?
Yes,
all right.
We can hear you.
So, I told the story in hindsight, and, I think if I told this at 90 days at a 12-step meeting, it sounded very different. Telling this at 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, now 6 years, the story is the same, but my truth is different, So I basically self-medicated in high school, maintained my grades. And really, when I found selling drugs in high school, that was like the wind in my sails to really get me to come out of my shell. I was an awkward kid with a stutter and just like wasn't a happy-go-lucky kid. And like when I found taking drugs, specifically cannabis and psychedelics and alcohol, and then cocaine and heroin came in too in high school, that was great for me at first. And then selling drugs like got me to go to parties and got me connected with people and gave me a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose. And around this time too, my mom got into drug use. She became addicted to cocaine. And, I think it was my junior year in high school, we had like a sit down moment where she was like, I'm not doing what you think I'm doing. I'm selling coke. And I was like, oh, no way. Like I sell weed. And it was like this really like interesting dynamic in my home. And then my mom decided to get sober and like, went to AA she went to a 12-step fellowship and did the thing. And then I couldn't, smoke pot in my house. I couldn't behave the way I wanted to. And she kind of met my stepdad and learned the wisdom of recovery. And they kind of said, just let him do his thing, let him spread his wings. And that kind of went on in their mind until they got a call from Lawrence General Hospital in Massachusetts that I had overdosed and they had given me naloxone 3 times and I wasn't really coming back because I had a bacterial infection. And at this point, my mom thought I was like eating mushrooms and like experimenting. She didn't know I'd become an injection drug user. And I really just didn't know what I didn't know. And I just like went further and further and further until I was a 20-year-old homeless injection drug user. This picture here on the left is me at 20, about to do really the only jail I ever saw was 30 days in county, but that's me going into county, withdrawing off of heroin, alcohol, and benzos. And basically, this was where I made my first resolution. Like, I'm not going to do drugs anymore. I just nearly died. I feel like crap. I have a bacterial infection. And I still like signed myself out AMA, but I went to go, stay in the woods to get away from the city because the city was my problem. And I kept finding these points of recovery that basically told me to be abstinent or like don't bother. And I was, in my early 20s, I smoke cannabis pretty regularly and I love it. And I, go back and forth in my relationship with it. But like back then it was a really, really big deal to me to smoke pot. Like it was very, very, very important to me. And I go to meetings and they would basically say like, well, like what's the point? Like I know you're trying to not shoot heroin. And so it basically was a cycle of like get arrested, go to rehab, overdose, go to rehab. I got like 5 get out of jail free cards. I basically really beat up my mental health though, to a point where the drugs that were at one time kind of helping me cope, like with the anxiety and depression, had now turned that into full-blown, psychosis and delusions. And I have seen detoxes, psych wards, hospitals. I've overdosed 3 different times where EMS had to come and reverse my overdose. And in 2014, it was like any other day. I was living in a vehicle. I was working for a temp agency. I went to my car and injected what I thought was heroin. It was fentanyl. And in 2014, that was kind of a newer thing. And so I overdosed. And this third picture here is me with Jed and Craig. They were 2 of the first responders who were at my overdose in 2014 that ultimately led me to my recovery. But it really wasn't there. And when I got brought to the hospital that last time I used injection drugs, I was treated like crap. Like I was really, really left, and I was in full withdrawal from the naloxone because naloxone is a really unpleasant sensation. It's like you're hot, you're cold, you're sweating, you're shivering, you're having a panic attack that hurts, it sucks. And then they tell you to just leave, like get out. And it was December of 2014. And so what do? I go and use drugs for like, a while. I get in my car and I drive because what else do I do? And I know now that God intervened. Someone called in my license plates, and it was actually 2 police officers in Exeter, New Hampshire, who, in general, they were adversarial to me, but they, stopped me. They treated me with dignity and respect. They, I cooperated with them, which is not my MO. And they encouraged me to seek treatment. And that's really what I did. And so in 2014, I spent Christmas in rehab in my 4th 28-day program. I had a really great counselor who helped me to address my issues, my mental health issues, and described to me that, like, yeah, you have a brain disorder that's preventable, treatable, it can go into remission. And explained to me the role of dopamine and, neuroplasticity and mindfulness and meditation and role models and, having emotional intelligence and mental health awareness. I wish I learned that when I was 12. Like I really, really, really wish the stuff I learned in rehab at 25, I learned in like 7th or 8th grade. I probably wouldn't have done so much drugs if I had yoga. Just saying, and so that led me into, working in human services a bit, getting into addiction treatment and recovery. I've worked for Manchester Safe Stations, a couple different versions. I've worked throughout addiction treatment and recovery, and I saw a lot of hypocrisy and double standards. And then I found harm reduction, and for me, harm reduction is the truth. There's no BS. There's no like sleight of hand. It's just harm reduction is what it is, meeting people where they're at, and we can kind of expand on that in a bit. And this last picture on the right is me. What I do currently is I operate a small syringe services program, the Claremont Exchange, in Sullivan County and Grafton County, New Hampshire, and Windsor County, Vermont. So I'm on the border of Vermont in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire, and I consistently use my negative lived experience for good. There's never been some like deep, dark moment in my past that I haven't drawn hope from and helped people. And I consider what I do a privilege. And it's really just wild what God had in store for me, because, you know, that first year of recovery, I was going to own sober houses. I was going to sponsor 10 men at a time. I was going to go to 5 meetings a week. And it's just weird that I haven't been to a meeting in like a year, and I've never been better. Recovery for me is just always improving by 1% wherever I can, however I can. And so part of that has been doing things like this and explaining harm reduction to people. I did not mean to eat 12 minutes on that. Sorry, but that was something I wrote down to kind of get into a bit. But yeah, I've really, part of my personal, or rather my professional path has been, you know, training EMS and first responders, because when you see people like me overdosing again and again and again, it seems like not great. Like our experience creates our vision of people. And it's been really great to go back and say, thank you. Thank you for what it is you do, this thankless work. We do find recovery, and I come from a social circle who's alive because of people like you. You know, like I've sit in rooms with people, and it's like, we've all been Narcan by first responders. So thank you. And we have plenty of time to get into harm reduction, but that was my lived experience that Ginger asked me to bring to y'all. So thanks. Sorry, Ginger.
No, that was awesome, Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you for sharing.
Cool. Yeah, it comes out how it comes out. You know, it's the same story, but depending on day of the week, mood, etc. But for the rest of the time, we'll talk about harm reduction and providing services to people. But, you know, I'm alive because of harm reduction. And harm reduction was really what I found professionally that allowed me to reconnect with people who I was told they don't care about you. Like they're not really your friend, and et cetera. But I come from a very loyal circle of people, like crime family type things, that like people would die for me and I would die for them. And so when I was told they didn't care about me, it didn't really sit right with me. And when I found harm reduction, I learned that I could go back to people I grew up with and, you know, spent a lot of time with and say, I'm here for you. I love you. Here's some Narcan. I love you and I'm here for you. Let me know when you're ready. And I had a very different approach than 12 steps or die. You know, that was really my experience, was that like nothing worked until I did the work in the 12 steps. And the 12 steps saved my life, and mental health counseling saved my life and gave me a foundation to grow. And it grew into harm reduction. And I just see harm reduction as crucial for, you know, recovery, because dead people don't enter recovery. And with harm reduction, all drug-related death and disease is preventable. But harm reduction is universal. We use it every day. You all use harm reduction more than most people with personal protective equipment, various things that you do. It's just a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with risky behavior. So any human behavior has risk associated to it, whether it's breathing, walking, shooting fentanyl, whatever it may be. And any human behavior serves a purpose. Like people don't do things for no reason. And so, you know, I really don't encourage my friends to jump out of the plane, but they're looking for adrenaline and dopamine and like a rite of passage. And so if they're going to jump out of the plane, harm reduction, wear a parachute, make sure the plane is inspected. You know, I could go on and on about harm reduction as a universal concept, but for me right now, harm reduction is dieting and not just crushing carbs until I hate myself. You know, I'm educated about what I put into my body. And for me, dieting is harm reduction. And I'm sure you can think of dozens of examples, but really we're going to talk about harm reduction as it relates to drug use. Would somebody care to read the slide for the group?
I can read it. Harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences associated with drug use. Harm reduction is also a social movement built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs.
Thank you. Has anybody seen harm reduction stuff that's more synonymous with this, with the second sentence there, the social movement? Anybody seen things like that? This is gonna be pretty new.
So I work with Maine access points, and I think that they take this approach.
Oh, definitely, they're great.
Yeah, they are great. And I know I work up at Roads to Recovery in Caribou, and myself personally, I am a huge advocate for harm reduction. And I agree that I'm very respectful of the people that I deal with. And, you know, I don't care if they're using drugs. That's really not my place to say anything. My job is just for me to get them what they need.
Yeah, I wanted to share on that one. Harm reduction as a social movement. I had the wonderful opportunity of being the director of the Holistically Healing Lodge, which is a residential a treatment program for substance abuse. And we looked at harm reduction, and I thought it was really important that we included the Suboxone treatment for people that were coming in and working on their wellness journey. And the Holistically Healing Lodge in Tobique First Nations in New Brunswick was the first treatment program to include the Suboxone or harm reduction program, and I'm quite proud of that. I think that is very beneficial for those people that are suffering from those opioid addictions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm glad that y'all aren't completely in the dark on some of this stuff. And I have met people from Northern Maine who do harm reduction work in the down east. So great that y'all are doing what it is you're doing. And for sure, medication-assisted recovery is part of harm reduction. And so there's many different definitions of harm reduction. This is one more that I think is a little more concise. Would somebody care to read this for the group before we trek on? Just volunteer to read the screen.
I can read it. According to harm reduction, I keep losing service, sorry. According to Harm Reduction International, harm reduction is a set evidence-based practices that minimize the negative impacts of drug use and ineffective drug policies. Harm reduction is grounded in principles that protect human rights and improve public health. It incorporates a wide array of approaches, including abstinence, designed to meet people where they are and offer opportunities for people to improve their health and well-being.
Thank you. Yeah, so we could go a lot of directions in this, but I always like to include that harm reduction is a spectrum of strategies, including abstinence. So for some people, harm reduction means they don't take drugs anymore. And I think of drugs as more of like a relationship to drugs. And really, it's about humanizing a dehumanized population and offering something beyond punishment and negative reinforcement, and providing services that meet people's needs based on their conditions now, and not giving people ultimatums and contingencies. And so I have another 40 minutes to cover quite a bit of stuff with you guys. We're going to get more specific now. That's just kind of a broad, what harm reduction may mean to somebody. Just think about what your harm reduction definition was before, and then maybe a little bit after this, think about, what you think of as harm reduction, because there's the services, the naloxone, the syringe services, the medication assisted recovery, and that's kind of like harm reduction, lowercase H&R, but then there's capital H&R harm reduction, and that's the justice and the liberty and the drug user rights stuff, and really looking at advocacy and politics. But we're definitely going to focus on little HR, and really that's, providing services to people. And as it relates to the work you're all doing, supporting people through these processes, it's really a framework for, working with people more efficiently, really having a strengths-based approach and looking for any positive change, any steps in the right direction, and offering positive reinforcement, and looking at, the humanity in people, and not offering contingencies and ultimatums and coercion, but just, what can we work on today to help you in your life? How can we improve your health and wellness today? and allow people to define their own goals by supporting people and not punishing them. But unfortunately, because of the war on drugs, our knee-jerk reaction to drug use is punishment. You know, we say we want to define a use disorder as continuing to use despite negative consequences. But throughout systems that deal with drug use, it's negative consequences and negative reinforcement. And so harm reduction is oftentimes a response to something. And so harm reduction is a response to, prohibition and the criminalization of people who use drugs. Because what happens when you criminalize drugs is a number of things, but really people lose their rights. They lose their dignity, they lose their autonomy, their agency, their freedom, they lose their family. And we think that that is an effective way to deal with use disorders. And so harm reduction is kind of a response to that. And really harm reduction grew, and we'll get into the HIV stuff in a bit, but really, as we get into harm reduction, it's a lens of science, not morality or ideology. It acknowledges that some drug use is safer than other drug use, and really looks at the context of drug use beyond just this drug is bad, don't do it. We look at the work of Dr. Norman Zinberg and looking at not just the drug, which is important, but also the set or the mindset, like what someone brings to the table. That could be their physical health, their mental health, their sense of belonging, their sense of well-being, and the expectation for the drug use and motivation for using the drug. And so I could be working with two different recoverees who are using literally the same drug supply in the same way. One, I might say like, hey, what are the benefits of your drug use? Why do you continue to use despite these negative consequences? And one might say, well, I guess it's because of my lower back pain. But then one might say, well, it makes the voices in my head stop. Those are like two different kind of recovery pathways. And each person is an individual with unique experiences. And drug use is kind of multifaceted and complicated. And if we focus just on the drug and how bad, really take away from the humanity that people are using this for a reason, supply and demand. There's a demand for stimulants, there's a demand for painkillers. And so sometimes asking people, what are the benefits to your drug use is a really eye-opening experience, because any human behavior serves a purpose. And if that behavior and purpose is so entrenched in survival in that dopamine area of the brain, then they may not be connecting their consequences to their behavior, because that behavior is like a life-sustaining activity to them. And so also harm reduction looks at the setting. This really great work of Dr. Norman Zinberg looks at the setting. And so if you're not familiar with illicit drug use like I am, thinking about alcohol, and oftentimes the drug alcohol, harm reduction lies in the setting. We offer people supervised consumption sites where they can go and consume regulated alcohol. They're given water, they practice harm reduction, they're given rides home. It's called a bar. We have supervised consumption sites already. And really, it looks at the stressors in someone's life, their environment, their socioeconomic status, their privilege or marginalization, where someone uses and who they use with. And also the cultural attitudes towards the drug use are really important, because right now there's a lot of stigma against people who use meth, especially within treatment and recovery systems, because it's not well understood. We seem to understand alcohol, we understand opioids, but cultural attitudes towards meth are like really kind of dicey for people in the recovery world. So it's really evolving pretty quickly. But really it's a way to understand drug use and, sorry, got ahead of myself. Why is this doing this to me? Sorry. All right, I'm with you. So the strategy of harm reduction, like little h, little r. Any questions or comments so far before we get into this next part? I'm just throwing stuff at you, I'm sorry. Concerns, comments? No worries. If it comes up, just pop into the chat or let me know. So the strategy of harm reduction maybe looks different for different regions, different agencies, but really this is certainly a not exhausting list. Y'all are familiar with naloxone, giving people treatment options and honoring their agency and autonomy, and not saying, go to whatever rehab you can go to, just get into the first one. Like, that's not healthcare. That's not honoring people's, freedom. So housing first models, giving people housing is really helpful, because housing is arguably the most determinant factor for successful recovery. And we wonder why there's such, there's a bad addiction problem, there's a bad homelessness problem. And housing first is really how many countries and now some states are addressing these issues, is giving people housing without contingencies. Of course, looking at drug policy reform and criminal justice reform. If we're not going to punish people for using drugs, how do we support them? What's more effective? Treatment, love, compassion, everything we know about use disorders. The science will win and the war on drugs will end, but just not today. And we're here today to kind of bridge the gap and keep people alive. And so healthcare is harm reduction. And for many people who use drugs, a syringe services program or a needle exchange program is healthcare for them. That's the only healthcare they're going to engage with. And that's the work that I do professionally. I run a small peer-to-peer mobile syringe services program. Really awesome work. On-site drug checking is kind of a new concept, giving people fentanyl test strips or reagent kits to see what's in their baggie, because there's no label on it. And even the best drug dealers don't give you an ingredients list. It's not like going to the store and saying, I want that juice. Oh no, this says high fructose corn syrup. I don't want that. It's not like, it's like if you went to the store and bought a 6-pack, but one of the 6 beers was like 120 proof and you couldn't tell the difference, and one beer got you blacked out and you had no idea. It's a dicey game, the illicit drug market, and you all see the kind of end result of that all too often. And so also harm reduction looks at safe supply. So that could be medication-assisted recovery like Suboxone or methadone, but also prescribing stimulants for people who are dependent on stimulants. Canada did it in response to COVID-19. There's a lot of great stuff coming out of Canada where if somebody is dependent on cocaine or meth, a doctor can now prescribe them stimulants, basically prescription amphetamines, to kind of mitigate the spread of COVID-19. And, it's treating a healthcare issue as a healthcare issue. And, as long as we treat this issue like a crime, we're not going to address it like a public health issue. And so it's really about asserting this as a healthcare issue, not a criminal issue. We're dealing with a medical issue, disorder, whatever you want to call it, but we have a long way to go for that. And harm reduction is looking at supervised use could look different place to place, but in New Hampshire right now, supervised use just really, for me, means telling people not to use alone. Use with others and carry naloxone. If you must use alone, have someone checking on you, because anytime someone I know and love died from an overdose, they were alone and behind a closed door because of stigma. And we really need to address the stigma, because stigma kills people. And what we're really talking about stigma is discrimination and oppression. And really this like losing 80,000 Americans in a year to drug overdoses is just ludicrous. And we really, New Hampshire has a bill in to bring supervised consumption sites to New Hampshire. Maine, especially Portland, some of my friends up there have been really vocal about wanting a supervised consumption site in Maine, because people don't die there. And there's a lot of them operating around the world. But that's the strategy in a nutshell. You could probably add some. Anybody have the desire to comment or ask a question before we chug along?
Ryan, we have a question in the chat from Steven.
Sure.
He says, how should we respond to the perspective that harm reduction serves to perpetuate the addiction?
So, Johann Hari, he says in a nutshell in one of his books, the opposite of addiction isn't necessarily sobriety, it's connection. And, connecting to people. And use disorders are characterized by feelings of isolation and loneliness. And we overcome that by connecting to our tribe, to our community, and telling stories and healing and having a sense of belonging and having a community around us that supports them. without contingencies on abstinence. And really what harm reduction programs do is it means that people are 3 times more likely to access treatment and 5 times more likely to stop injecting. And it creates a pathway to recovery and keeps people alive, because dead people don't enter recovery. And when you really get into people's experience of going from active addiction to recovery, there is harm reduction 100% of the time. You just need to look for it. Everybody who's ever like gone from an addictive relationship to drugs to any sort of recovery, there was a bridge of harm reduction. You just don't use the word harm reduction yet, but it's universal. It's all around you. And it really aligns well with the most traditional treatment approaches. Does that help? You want to?
Yes, that did help. Thank you. Particularly the statistics about how much it helps as a first step towards true recovery. That it's not just placating an addiction. It is moving them to a better situation in life.
Yeah,
Ryan, I think it's fabulous the way that you presented that too. Like everybody who's entered into any recovery has gone through the harm reduction pathway, no matter what way you look at it. There's no way around it. You have to go through that. And that's the reality, but we have been conditioned to look at it in this framework, right? It perpetuates addiction. It just, continues the problem. Well, like Ryan said, we've been doing it all along. It's time to change the stories.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was awesome. Great question.
Yeah, and if somebody wants to have this conversation, there's about 30 plus years of research to back it. And well, we can get into more than that in a bit. And these slides will be available. I believe my stuff is all open source if you want them. I'm available to discuss this stuff further, but so that's the strategy. And, a couple of disclaimers I like to throw in there because this could sound like I'm perpetuating addiction or like it's not about whatever happens. It's not about anything goes. It's about controlling an uncontrolled situation, because right now what we're doing is clearly not working. Anything that prohibition and the war on drugs has set out to stop has done the opposite effect. Addiction, overdose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Harm reduction, and just to really quickly respond to you, Stephen, too, is I really like to emphasize that treatment starts with how someone is treated. And so there's capital H, capital R harm reduction, there's little h and r, but there's also conversational harm reduction. We're showing people love and compassion and dignity and respect, and being present and having an open ear is really sometimes all it takes for somebody to feel empowered, have a little bit of education, and make a better decision. And that snowball effect of recovery is a natural process that people go through. And sometimes it's about, not giving them what everyone else is giving them, negative reinforcement, and just saying, hey, like, I love you regardless. And so there is also that conversational harm reduction where you don't need to be giving someone needles or Narcan. You can use these philosophies everywhere, and philosophies of meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there, taking them with us and supporting people to change their behavior. And people don't come to, people come to I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll finish this slide here. So this is not about helping a person who stopped using to start using again. And it's certainly not condoning, endorsing, or encouraging drug use. It's just acknowledging that this is happening, and there's an evidence-based way to support it. And working in addiction treatment and recovery, we're held to a high standard of evidence-based. Where's the evidence? Where's the research? I want to see the evidence and research on jails and prisons to address use disorders. Show me something that shows me that that's an effective use of billions of dollars. But this isn't a conversation about legalization either. I don't think legalization is the answer. I don't think decriminalization today is the answer, but it's got to be a middle of the road approach. And harm reduction is effort for effort. And that goes throughout life, effort for effort, meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there. And, now we're going to get into the more pragmatic stuff that y'all have probably signed up for more traditionally. So, all right, I already answered that question. So I'm sure y'all are familiar with SAMHSA's definition of recovery. It's a process of change where people improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and reach their full potential. I like this because I can do this 6 years into recovery, and I can improve my health and wellness, be more self-directed, and strive to reach my full potential. I'm peaking in life. I'm always improving by 1% where I can, wherever I can, however I can, and I don't get stagnant in recovery. And it's really amazing for me that, you know, I can say, like, I'm a person who uses cannabis in the evenings and on the weekends, and that adds to the and when that relationship becomes problematic, I take a step back and I take breaks and I keep it in check. And if I hadn't learned about harm reduction with my 12-step background, I don't know what would have happened when I broke up with that girl and was depressed for a week and decided to hit a joint. I was told I was going to die. I was told if I hit that joint, I was going to die, but the opposite kind of happened. And it, you know, I know now that a lot of people with PTSD are prescribed cannabis, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Like, it just, a lot of this made a lot of sense to me. And if it wasn't for harm reduction, I don't know where I would have been, 3.5 years into recovery and, having a slip and realizing that, that behavior serves a purpose. And this is a important definition of recovery too, because people in early stages of contemplation, pre-contemplation, they can do this stuff. They can improve their health and wellness without getting sober. They can live a self-directed life without being clean and abstinent. And they can reach their full potential and use drugs, because unfortunately, the truth is, and this is okay, some people's full potential includes self-medicating with illegal drugs. And that's okay. They're doing the best they can, and they can do better. What they can do better is their choice. And the best path for anybody is the path that they choose. And if someone's path includes drug use, then let's love them anyway. Because just be kind, like, people are suffering and people aren't taking painkillers for no reason. There's a pain. And the people that are dying because of this are really just people whose needs are not met and whose hearts were too big and they're self-medicating. And it's just challenging. Our society just vilifies people, and it keeps people away from recovery. And recovery is so beautiful. I love it. I so great. And it's, but it wouldn't be possible without harm reduction. I was illegally provided sterile equipment. I was given an education. And because of two people who gave me supplies and education, I never got Hep C. I never got a serious bacterial infection after that first one when I was 20. And I have a clean bill of health. And I'm alive because of harm reduction. And so we're going to kind of get into kind of the recovery stuff here in a bit. And it's really, I like to just kind of set the foundation that substance use falls on a continuum. We're all born abstinent of drug-taking behavior. Of course, there's neonatal abstinence syndrome, but we aren't born taking drugs. Most people will experiment with caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, etc. Some will, I would say most people in America will occasionally or socially use an intoxicant. Some might argue it's part of the human experience. Whatever that might be, whether it's the nice strong coffee I have here, whether it's the nicotine some of you will smoke on your next break, or whether it's, the fentanyl going around in your community. Drug use is something that happens on a continuum. And so people experiment, they go occasional. Less and less people kind of go on the continuum to, that M word, moderation. I never heard that M word in 5 years of in and out of treatment, but really that was my goal. I just didn't have the words for it. I was told my goal is abstinence. So I'm in chaotic, heavy drug use, and now my goal is to be abstinent. But that's actually not my goal, and I was failed. And I was kind of told I failed, but I learned a lot through treatment and rehab, and each time it saved my life for sure. But, I just really wasn't having my needs met. And so eventually I had a place in my life where I could maintain abstinence, and that's great. But really it's, fewer and fewer people go moderation, heavy, or chaotic. But what I saw recently was that like 16% of housed Americans meet criteria for some sort of use disorder. Like, that's crazy. And it was more housed Americans than I thought, and it was only like less than 70% of unhoused people have a use disorder, or maybe even like, so it was just interesting that it's a growing problem. And the reason it's a growing problem is because of, you know, it being illegal. And that's another conversation. I'm going to get off the tracks again, but we're talking about use disorders. And so it's a chronic health condition, and we treat any health condition, you know, in incremental change steps, reduction of symptoms, you know, any step in the right direction is great because this is a lifelong condition, but we don't really treat use disorders like that. We basically tell them to sort out most of their symptoms and come to us when you need our expectations. Meet us where we're at. You know, it's kind of backwards in my mind. And so we tell people, go to this treatment, go to this acute care for substance use disorder, hit a bottom, hit diagnostic criteria, go through pain. When you hit a bottom, you'll be ready. You'll go to treatment, you'll come out, you'll love your life, you'll find a job, you'll have a hobby and interest, you'll have housing and find God and spirituality and a sense of belonging. And it just doesn't happen very often. And we spend billions on this approach. And we basically create unnecessary suffering by telling people that this is what you're supposed to do. But if we look at a recovery-oriented system, it's about meeting the needs of the individual based on their needs. And this will look different person to person. This is basically me. You know, I went to rehab. I found God and Jesus through church. I had a job right away. I had social support, a family that housed me and fed me. I had peer support. I had family. When I was basically a year and a half sober and flushing heroin down the toilet, working in treatment, it blew my mind. But I had filled in the gaps around me. And, you know, sometimes, you know, the gap I like to highlight is that, you know, I was a cannabis guy, and growing cannabis was like part of my hobby, like spring, summer stuff. And gardening was a game changer for me because I had all this downtime. I like plants. I like being outside, and I'm bored. I found growing peppers and tomatoes to be like foundational that first year. I mean, I still garden every year for sure. It's gotten bigger and bigger the past 6 years, but I had to fill in the gaps around me. And so think about this as an exercise for somebody who three or four of their circles is drugs, buying, selling, using, thinking about drugs. And you want to take that away. What do they want to fill that in with? And for most people in recovery in America, rehab isn't one of their circles. It's just not. People find it on their own. Most people in recovery did not go to the traditional rehab that we think everybody did. And it's just, you know, it's about the individual and people defining their goals. And we can't have this without harm reduction, because harm reduction insulates people from inequity and these society, the stigma and stuff. So harm reduction makes this possible, but really we don't see this very often until more recently. And really the goals of a recovery-oriented system and harm reduction is to improve the health and well-being of individuals and the community around them. And also, I would say the difference in my experience between the recovery community and the harm reduction community was that when I found the harm reduction community, there was like a broader spectrum of acceptable dialogue. Like we could talk about politics in a way that was more genuine, and, you know, talking about people's experience with poverty and racism and classism and homophobia and isolation and how that relates to drug use. And my experience with the 12 steps was that, like, you're the problem. You use drugs because you're the problem. Find God, take inventory, go help others. And like, that's great for me because I'm like a privileged white male and I could like do that. But really, people are medicating things that we don't understand. And I just think it's unfair to not look at issues of discrimination and trauma in people, and as that being a factor in why they're using drugs to begin with. And how do we address those things? We don't. I stopped focusing on the big picture and I focused on the person in front of me with dignity, respect, compassion, love, and empowerment. And once people are shown that love and empowerment, they're going to reduce their own harm and they're going to be on that natural pathway of recovery. It's a little nudge. It's a little safety net. It's a little insulation. And so this will probably get into some stuff that Ginger's gonna talk to you about at some point, probably with motivational interviewing and asking open-ended questions and seeing, you know, what do you want? Like, what do you want to your future to look like? And, you know, empowering them to make better choices by making them feel welcome and have a sense of belonging. And, you know, harm reduction community is very genuine. And I just felt like in the recovery world, there was a lot of like this corporate entity and then this, and then there's like this recovery thing. And it just seems like, I won't get into that. I love harm reduction a lot. And it dovetails so well into the recovery, and the recovery community in New Hampshire really embraced harm reduction the way that it didn't happen in many states the way that it did. But we all have the same goal, to keep people alive and, you know, find recovery that makes sense for them. And remembering that recovery is not synonymous with abstinence. You know, people can be in recovery and use drugs. Like, I'm a person in long-term recovery and I'm a person who uses drugs. Two things can be true there. And that's an idea that really gets into, you know, coaching people through harm reduction, through moderation management, and asking people, is it your goal to be abstinent? And what motivates you to change? You know, what are the benefits to your using? How are you staying safe? And I get triggered sometimes when my mom's like, be safe, be good. Like, asking the question, how are you staying safe, is a really cool question, because it gets annoying for drug users when everybody in their life says, be safe, be safe. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean? And, you know, asking, you know, using motivational interviewing can really, you know, get people to do some soul searching, to look inward as like what it is they're doing. And because we just have a lot of superficial conversations in our society, and harm reduction is oftentimes about really uncomfortable, heavy conversations where the goal is to not provide judgment and shame and blame. And it's sometimes hard to keep a dialogue open and honest, because this stuff is really tragic. This isn't minimizing the tragedy of it. This is bringing some love and compassion to really tragic situations, and, you know, honoring people's humanity. And keep doing that. Like, all right. Sorry, guys. I probably gave you a headache. So, any questions on moderation before we slide through to the last part that Ginger wants me to cover? So, I'm going to rip through the syringe services stuff to get to the engagement stuff at the end. And then we'll hopefully have time for maybe half a question. So the CDC this year released a report that they estimate that 1% of all American adults have hepatitis C because of lack of surveillance, baby boomers, and now injection drug use. They're now saying that every American adult at least once should be tested for Hep C, and every woman when she's pregnant should be tested for Hep C every time, because it's a potentially fatal disease that's now treatable and curable. And the goal is to get people to know their status and do the 8 to 12 week treatment to be cured. Because this is a really, really, really serious issue that's gone undetected since the 40s. So, well, since the 60s really, but people that are born in the 40s. So a big response to that would be harm reduction programs, like syringe services programs that prevent the spread of disease. It's really important to know your status for HIV, of course, especially if somebody thinks that they've been infected early on. That's their highest risk for spreading. So if somebody thinks they've been exposed, hopefully they have a place in your community where they can go be tested for HIV. And if there's not a place for people, especially injection drug users, to be tested for HIV in their community, it's a big problem. If you look at Washington County, Maine, and the role of injection OxyContin in that community, what that did with HIV and the whole thing, like, definitely would encourage you to look at HIV testing and Hep C testing in your community. And also access to sterile syringes reduces infections like endocarditis and soft tissue wounds. So syringe service programs So the numbers based on, congregate 30 years of research is people who inject drugs are 5 times more likely to access treatment and 3 times more likely to stop injecting. They do not increase crime or drug use. They're cost effective. If you can't get them on compassion, get them on fiscal. They protect law enforcement and first responders by taking dirty needles off the streets. If it's decriminalized, they're more likely to tell you where their needles are. It's a point for engagement and intervention. So they come for the needle. They don't really realize they're getting, healthcare, wound care, crisis intervention, access to treatment, peer support. There's a lot of endorsements for syringe services programs. In that 30 years of research for specifically syringe services, there's never been empirical data or research that said it's a bad idea. And if you don't like what I say, do you like any of these organizations? Really, it's and it's a great way to get out in naloxone and prevent overdose deaths, because we're in a really dramatic increase in fatal overdoses throughout the country. Not looking good right now because of fentanyl. I don't have enough time, Ginger. I messed up.
Well,
so what's the most important, Ginger? The opioid overdose brain injury stuff, or I could probably just do that super quick, actually.
Okay. See where you go.
So, yeah, so overdoses are heavy, and you all know that. I don't need to tell you about this, but it's important to recognize that people make decisions based on their circumstances. And when you're looking at somebody who's experiencing an overdose, you're looking at like a long story that's led to that moment. And that's not a high point in that person's life. And you probably won't ever see most of the overdoses you've reversed again, but they end up in circles like mine. And, we go on and do cool things. And, it's just, it's hard though, because there's just so much built into it. And it's hard to be compassionate and empathetic when you see this person time and time again. And really, it's oftentimes because the opioids have depressed the brain from the front to the back to the brain stem, and their brain has been off, and then it turns back onto the naloxone. And if they were out for more than 3 minutes, they may have sustained an anoxic brain injury from lack of oxygen, or hypoxic from long-term reduced oxygen. And this really affects the parts of the brain that are crucial for recovery. And if this intrigues you, there's a New Hampshire PBS documentary, and the link is right here, kind of talking about this. And there's also some interagency work going on with the Brain Injury Association of Vermont and New Hampshire. And I think Maine as well has some sort of entity that's looking at this. Super important stuff. I know you all know your Good Samaritan law. Medications, for sure. It's really important to know the difference when talking to people. Naltrexone, the pills, or the Vivitrol shot is an antagonist or a blocker of opioids. So it reduces cravings by blocking opioid sites in the brain. People can sometimes have a really bad reaction to this, and they don't like it. It makes them a little bit anxious. And that's because your brain and your body produce its own opioids. The term endorphin is short for endogenous morphine. So if you're constantly blocking your opioid sites, for some people, that's not great. For some people, it's a life changer. And I saw so many people who were just, some may call hopeless, find Vivitrol, and it was the game changer for them. And I love it. It's an important option, but it's not an opioid. It's an opioid antagonist. Buprenorphine or Suboxone is a partial opioid agonist. It binds to some of the sites, and it can help with withdrawal symptoms. Great, easily accessed point of recovery for opioid dependence. So if someone's dependent on opioids, they want to take buprenorphine or Suboxone or methadone. Some people have a bad reaction to buprenorphine too and do much better on methadone. But my experience in New Hampshire is most people can't get methadone. And with the new fentanyl being lipophilic or stored in the fat, it's harder and harder for people to start buprenorphine. And so methadone access is really important for people. And you may hear people tell you at this, when you see them on the front lines, like, I can't get on the Suboxone, it just makes me sick. they go into precipitated withdrawal because the newest batch of fentanyl coming from China and Mexico is lipophilic or stored in fat. So it's like crazy physically addictive. And so methadone is important. And so telling people don't use alone, go slow, wait to use till you feel in control. Don't mix drugs, especially don't mix depressants. If you're sick and you have an illness in your heart and lungs, you have a lower blood oxygen level, higher risk for overdose. Water is harm reduction. Everybody drink more water today. Like water is like kind of my go-to of people who are like just rough around the edges when they're leaving, rather than saying, be well, do good. I'll say, drink a bottle of water. I like yell at some of my people because they just don't drink water. People can test their drugs for fentanyl with fentanyl test strips and know how to respond to an overdose. This is what Ginger wanted me to hit with 3 minutes left. So expectations for supporting people who use drugs. Meet them. Weird today, sorry. Meet them where they're at, but don't leave them there. Remember that any behavior serves a purpose, including lying, manipulation, stealing, all these behaviors that are learned, they have to be unlearned. And so it's frustrating for me to be like, yo, you're 3 months sober, why are you stealing? Because they learned that behavior, why are you still lying? And sometimes that process can take a long time. And behavior change is really hard. Behavior change is like really, really, really difficult. And for drug use, drugs have kind of altered the brain in a way that reinforces it. And so they might not be thinking rationally. Their priority may not be meeting. Their priority on a physiological level is drugs. And that is dependence, and that's unfortunate. But really look at the humanity in that and remember that, any human behavior can both help and harm. And sometimes it's about that positive reinforcement, that strength-based approach. That's a different way to look at it from a different angle under a different light. And ask them what their barriers are and don't assume. Creating an open and honest space for dialogue is really important, but don't punish honesty because, it's a lot about trust and faith in people. Harm reduction is really about faith in people and trust. And just understand that they're doing the best they can and they can do better, and what they want to improve is their decision. And so take your time and remember that, be aware of your expectations. And for me lately, my expectations for me are getting projected on other people, and it's not healthy. So, we're all individuals doing the best we can. I try to do away with judgments and expectations. And my goal is to listen, observe, and if it's appropriate, communicate. But the more I get into recovery, coaching philosophies, and MI stuff, the less I talk and the better I am at what is supporting people, because people just want to be heard, so we could spend a lot of time on this stuff, but be consistent and reliable. And people like drugs for a number of reasons, but oftentimes it gives them a sense of freedom and autonomy and a sense of belonging, and it's reliable. And so they're looking for that in places elsewhere. So the illusion of control is a big one. They like control and sense of belonging, and then they go into systems that have none of that. And so really remembering those values are really important, and celebrating any progress. Be respectful of people's spaces. Consent. Do you consent to these services? And y'all are familiar with that because they have to sign consent sometimes, but not everyone is aware that consent should always be a conversation for most services. And have realistic expectations. Laugh if you can. Don't go alone. Set limits. And remember, and this is kind of probably how I'll wrap it up, how do you handle grief? What is your process for grief? I work in a space where you're basically told that it's okay that they died as part of the job. That's not okay with me. That death is not an acceptable consequence of drug use. But throughout our society, you really find people who believe that if someone tries drugs, it's acceptable that death is a potential outcome. People who use drugs do not deserve to die. And we really need to say that loud, that it is not okay that 80,000 people are dying in a 12-month period with the most expensive healthcare system in the world. We can't keep people alive. those are 80,000 people whose needs were not met, and those are 80,000 policy failures. So really, there's a macro level of grief going on, and there needs to be some reconciliation and restorative justice, because this is all right, I'm just gonna stop. How do you handle burnout? This is me handling burnout. Do you guys bill by the 15-minute or what's going on here? Because I have all sorts of vicarious trauma and burnout that I work through. Yoga is the answer for me. People don't want to be rescued. I know that y'all are first responders, but like, people oftentimes don't want to be rescued. They want to be met with dignity and respect on equal terms. And I was over by a minute, but that was my PowerPoint. Happy to take questions or comments and stay as long as you'd like. This is my contact info. Like I said, happy to stay on and chat for a bit, but that is my spiel.
Thank you, Ryan. That was fantastic. Are there any comments or questions for Ryan?
I'm interested in slowly perusing the PowerPoint, because it's like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant. But it had a lot of great information, Ryan. Very eye-opening.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely would have done better with 2 or 3 hours, but this was kind of a baptism by fire. Here you go.
That's probably a better way to put it. It wasn't a negative comment. It was just a lot of good information there.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Ryan, I know you mentioned that the second time that policemen met you and they treated you with respect, you had a positive outcome out of that. Can you elaborate more about what the difference is when you had a negative response to EMS or first responders versus when they were compassionate and empathetic towards you? And how can, what tools can you give EMS to talk or provide when they see someone that has an overdose or coming out of an overdose?
Great question. And my mind went, I think, 5 different places. But basically, your first question was that like last police interaction that was very different. So I was a drug dealer. When I encountered police, they had questions. They know my work, like they know what's up. And they were waiting at my parents' house when my plates got called in a town over. Like they were like, oh, Ryan Fowler, let's go over here. He's going to be pulling up. And, you know, there they were. And it was just a more casual, less hostile conversation. I was also just beat. I had overdosed that morning. I was just tired and like I wanted help. And so that was a part of it too. And I feel like God is working through me in a lot of ways, and that like typically I would have been like hiding things and going crazy, but I was just like, I had been driving and shooting up, and like there was like an uncapped needle under my seat, and I was just like, all right. And I think that was the start of something really positive, because they really appreciated that. And then really from there, it was just like, there wasn't any like, so like, we want to get so-and-so, will you wear a wire? It was like my interactions oftentimes with police. First responders was just get them in, get them out. And that was the experience that morning. But really, when I read the police report, what stuck out to me was that it talked about me being like visibly dehydrated and visibly not well. And it was like they took sympathy or empathy, and it wasn't like, F this, fill in the blank, you know. It was just, and we had a conversation at the station that was just like, wow, you sound intelligent. What are you doing with your life? And they like used MI on me in hindsight. And it was like, oh, like, do you want to go back to treatment? Like, tell me more about that. It was just a very different experience. And so just, you know, sometimes less is more. Sometimes just being present for somebody is really refreshing. And when it comes to post-overdose, remembering that the brain was just shut off is important. Give them at least an hour to have that real conversation, because, you know, they're in very fight or flight. So the overdose, brain shuts off, naloxone, brain back on. They got fight or flight and very minimal to no memory recall. And so how frustrating is it when you're responding and they come to and they tell you that they didn't use drugs? They just literally don't remember it. They literally are like sifting through memories that aren't plugged in yet. And so that's really frustrating. And it's like, I've seen you twice this week. What do you mean you didn't use drugs today? It's like the memory's not there. And so I like the idea of like a concise like card or pamphlet, and then a follow-up 1 to 24 to 48 hours later. I think that's where the magic happens. And also remembering that, you know, people, you know, want this sense of control and autonomy and freedom. And that can be, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
That was a great question. Thank you. Oh, and I had a question prior, Ginger. Was that this one, right? About, was it ketamine?
Oh yeah, the ketamine one. Yeah.
So there was a question that came regarding ketamine, and is it addictive, not addictive? And oftentimes when we talk about addictive drugs, we're talking about drugs that are primarily dopamine agonists. So they give you floods of dopamine, and dopamine reinforces life-sustaining activities like eating food, drinking water, seeking shelter, having sex, caring for children. Your brain gives you dopamine to reinforce a life-sustaining activity. Drugs like opioids, stimulants like meth or cocaine, many traditionally addictive drugs, are one of their mechanisms of action is a flood of dopamine. They all do multiple things with multiple neurotransmitters, and different neurotransmitters do different things in different parts of the brain. And so the question about ketamine was that it does have addiction potential for sure, and I've experienced that personally, and I see it in people in my life, but it is not primarily a dopamine agonist. Ketamine is called a glutamate antagonist. There's like a sodium ion channel in your brain that has all these little binding sites, and ketamine, PCP, nitrous oxide, dissociative anesthetics bind to these sites and block this sodium channel. And from there, it just does many different things, from hallucinations to pain control, anesthetics. So people can become addicted to that, but it's not like the physical addiction that's synonymous with dopamine agonists like opioids, meth, and cocaine. And so it becomes a little bit more nuanced when it gets into like the newer drugs like ketamine or MDMA, or like some of the ones that are like being used clinically for like positive things. And it's like in the news and it seems really great, right? And then you're like, well, if ketamine's used to treat depression, why are my 10 friends addicted to it? You know, but it looks weird person to person because it's not physically addictive. Does that answer the question? That was kind of what that was kind of, yeah.
Ryan, and how I understood the question, there's kind of a two-part to the question. And the previous part was talking about pain management for people that had substance use issues. And so they were wondering, you know, he had used ketamine in profession before to treat people that had substance use issues as a pain management tool. But he was wondering if that spurred, you know, craving towards, if that affected their substance use at all negatively.
So it's like a really old one-liner that's, the poison is in the dose. And there are non-clinical and clinical applications of ketamine to help treat addiction. So it can actually help someone with addiction in the right setting with the right clinician. And I'm not making any claims, but there is that aspect to it. And then there is the opioid phenomena where first response, even AMR in Manchester, at the site of a very traumatic physical injury, they'll administer ketamine instead of morphine now, because there's so many people who that opioid sets off the dopamine agonist stuff in the front part of the brain here. And that can be triggered pretty quickly because that's like very acute, it's very prominent. And so the goal, like kind of what you're talking about, is opioid alternatives and ketamine. So yeah, for sure, for pain at the scene of an accident or whatever, but also in a clinical setting too. If you have money, you could go to a place in any state and pay for off-label prescription of ketamine. And you can go to infusion clinics. There's one in northern New Hampshire. There's one in, they're around. You could Google it. And you basically pay hundreds of dollars and they hook you up to an IV, and it's wildly effective for pain that's not treated traditionally, or for people who don't want to take opioids. A lot of research needs to be done on this for sure, because it's always a double-edged sword. And so I think, yeah, I definitely would support it as an alternative. But yeah, does that answer the question more?
I think so. Thank you.
All right. If there's no more questions, thank you everybody for being here and all your participation, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes, and I will be getting all of the slides and the recording to you later today. So be watching out for that in your emails. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank y'all. That was great. I'm just reading the chat.